In this video, I'm going to explore and explain how a book published by a New Age hustler and fraud called Paul Levy, this is his book, The Quantum Revelation, a radical synthesis of science and spirituality. I shall explore how he has plagiarized my work. My first book, Quantum Buddhism, was published in 2010. Levy actually contacted me to say he thought my work was fantastic, should be known more widely, and he wanted to do his own book on this subject. He even asked what other books which I was publishing would be good for him to read. So he indicated he was going to use my work in some way as a basis. What I did not expect was a degree of plagiarism, i.e. the taking over of sentences, paragraphs and ideas on many pages of his work. I mean, obviously not all, but a significant number, enough to make it plagiarism. Many of the ideas he rips off from my work are completely unreferenced, even though they clearly have their origin in my work. Not only this book, but some other books that I've written. Also, I shall explore some of the utter nonsense and drivel that Paul Levy promotes in this book. Quotes misrepresented, physicists said to say the opposite to what they actually do say, quotes constantly inflated in their meaning, and plagiarism of other people as well, here and there. Now, the inspiration, or the motivation rather, for doing this video is that I am promoting my recent book, Quantum Revelations of the Real and Unreal. And the last chapter in this book, which I have called A Quantum of Plagiarism, goes into great detail. So that there is documentary evidence, clear evidence of the plagiarism. There's no doubt about it. In order to establish at the outset that my claim that Paul Levy has plagiarized my work has some basis in reality, I shall give a small example. An interesting example because of its cheekiness. Here's an example. I came up with a joke one evening when I was writing, and my friend Eric, who was the proofreader and discussion partner, was with me, and I came up with the following joke, and I'm reading here from my second book, Quantum Buddhist Wonders of the Universe. It is indeed astonishing how often physicists talk about various possible toes, or theories of everything, which have nothing to say about consciousness. One would have thought it fairly obvious that without an account of consciousness, any toe would not have a leg to stand on. Now, Eric thought his joke was hilarious, and we had a good laugh about it, and I was quite pleased with the joke. You don't often get, the chance to make jokes when you're doing quantum metaphysics, but there you go. So anyway, that's my joke. It appeared in 2 books, Quantum Buddhism, Quantum Buddhist Wonders of the Universe. Now, Paul Levy must have thought it was a great joke as well, because he nicked it and put it in without pointing to its origin, without referencing its origin, in his book. We have page 181 of his Quantum Revelation, but this isn't a revelation, it's copied from my book. Page 181. In excluding consciousness from their toe, however, it is as if corporatized physicists are saying that consciousness is not a phenomenon that is part of the whole universe, which is to say that their toe doesn't have a leg to stand on. No, there's no way that's a coincidence. And when you see the other bits of cutting and pasting that's done, the plagiarism is clear. Now that's just a joke, but later on in this video I will indicate how he's actually just plundered ideas which were actually unique to me and presented them pretty much as if they were his own. However, I should also say that both in this book and in this video, which is pretty much all based around exploration of Paul Levy's New Age mystical, misguided and over-inflated rampage, as well as his plagiarism. And in the last chapter of this book, there will be insights and discussion of some issues in quantum metaphysics along the way. The other point I need to make is that the chapters prior to the Levy chapter in this book deal with lots of other issues in a similar kind of terrain. We're dealing with deception, misrepresentation, overinflation on the part of New Age fanatics, as well as what we could call misrepresentation on the part of people who want to present a more materialist view of quantum discoveries. So I'll just read the first paragraph of the introduction to this book to give a flavour of what the book in general is about. The introduction is titled Extremes of the Quantum New Age. The primary areas of concern for this book, which lie within the field of quantum philosophy, metaphysics, and implications for the understanding of spiritual worldviews, are twofold. Firstly, to clearly present some remarkable conclusions it is possible to safely make concerning the relationship between modern quantum discoveries and the claims of spiritual worldviews, focusing primarily on Buddhist metaphysics. Secondly, to highlight 2 misleading intellectual agendas of deception which operate today within the realm of quantum philosophy and spirituality. Within this latter concern, I also focus on a particularly egregious example of New-Age Propheteering, wherein a recent New-Age Propheteer has plagiarized my work for his own advancement. Now, as an introduction to this video, I'm going to show you some very brief clips of Paul Levy being hailed as almost a cosmic god sent down from the quantum realm to reveal the secrets of the universe to us suffering human beings. Anyway, here we go.
Hi again, everyone. I'm here today with Paul Levy, who's a pioneer in the field of spiritual emergence. He is a wounded healer in private practice, assisting others who are also awakening to the dreamlike nature of reality. Among his books are The Quantum Revelation, A Radical Synthesis of Science and Spirituality, and Descend. Paul's been a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner for over 35 years. He was the coordinator for the Portland Padmasambhava Buddhist Center for over 25 years. And his website is awakeninthedream.com. Hi, Paul. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, yeah, I'm so happy to be here with you. Thank you.
I am so excited about your book. We're here to discuss the quantum revelation today. Interesting subject, quantum physics, as you well know.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your book a quote by Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who questions if it's even possible to speak of experts in a field that nobody understands, where they literally do not know what they are talking about. So if you had to, under penalty of something really terrible, describe what quantum physics is to someone who doesn't know in 3 or 4 sentences, what would you say?
Sure. Yeah, no, totally. And so first off, I'm not a physicist at all. And so quantum physics, it's considered the greatest discovery ever in all of history in the realm of science. That there's not a debate about. The controversy is, what does it mean? And quantum physics, from my point of view, has empirically proven that this is a dream, that we're having a collective dream. And it's unlocking the most unimaginable creative energy that's intrinsic to our nature.
And I cannot thank Paul enough for having done the quite extraordinary work that he has done. When I read his book, Quantum Revelation, I finally began to understand the extraordinary contributions of modern physics. I'd read many other books on modern physics, but Paul brought it all together with his lucidity and brilliance and passion and enthusiasm in such a way that I found myself ruining myself and giving copies of it to everybody I knew.
Now, of course, I'm predisposed to take a positive view of valid and well presented correspondences, relationships between aspects of quantum metaphysics and spiritual worldviews. Because I've written 8 books on the topic of the relationship between quantum physics, Buddhist philosophy, and quantum physics and spirituality to a lesser extent, in general, what I am robustly against is over-fantasizing, over-inflating, overstating to the point of absurdity various aspects. And the reason for objecting to this behavior is that it is counterproductive, because people who pick up books like this, who know what they're talking about, rather than people who do follow Levy, and he's got a vast following, they're all over the internet saying that this guy's changed their lives, which is possible. Fantasies can change people's lives, there's no doubt about it. It's not that what Paul Levy says is completely and absolutely false. There is a kernel of truth. One of the reasons that I decided to embark upon the research and the writing of my first book, Quantum Buddhism, was that I'd done an awful lot of research and realised that although there were some very good books, and as I usually say, foremost are the books of B. Alan Wallace, such as Choosing Reality. Hidden Dimensions is another one by Wallace. Absolutely excellent. But even so, they still do not go into the kind of precise detail which I thought was necessary really to clinch the case that there are deep and significant interrelationships and parallels. Parallels is probably not a good word, because parallels, you kind of think, well, they could just be analogies. It's not the case at all. See, when you realise that if you look at Buddhist Madhyamaka, for example, quite clearly the Madhyamaka states that what appears to be a material world is empty, and that is a Buddhist technical term, empty of substantial existence. It doesn't exist the way it appears. And in fact, the Madhyamaka stated that the material world, is more like, what can we say, an illusion, like an illusion, in that it appears to be solid and it functions as if it's solid, but it's not solid, and it derives from an immaterial source. Okay? So even there you have quite a precise connection. However, something else that Madhyamaka states quite clearly, and this hasn't been noticed by that many scholars in the West, is that the nature of emptiness, the ultimate nature of reality, is that it neither exists, nor not exists, nor both of these, nor neither of these. Now this sounds like, just kind of Eastern, or what can we say, Eastern obfuscation and mystical imprecision, perhaps, until you discover, amazingly, that the existential nature of a quantum field is that it neither exists, nor does it not exist, nor both of these, nor neither of these. And I discovered that this was the nature of a quantum field through reading this book by Giancarlo Girardi, very important quantum physicist, Sneaking a Look at God's Cards. He actually expresses his surprise that the classical everyday world emerges from a field of potentiality which it doesn't exist, it doesn't not exist, nor both of these, nor neither of these. And it's stated in terms of position in here, neither here, nor there, nor both, nor in either place. And he's talking about a quantum entity. Now, I was astonished. Here is a direct mapping between the Madhyamaka and the existential configuration of a quantum field. And as far as I know, nobody else has seen or written about this. And I wrote about it in great detail going into the analysis of the nature of superposition and so forth. And this is one of the connections, very precise, very detailed, which is part of my work. There are others which have not been written about, certainly not written about in great detail, but in other places, in other books. This is why a couple of years ago, a quantum physicist, actual retired, but a person who had been a quantum physicist, a working quantum physicist, and also someone very interested in a researcher in Eastern religions, contacted me to say he was amazed at the detail and quality of the research that I had carried out and then written about with such lucidity. Mike Roper said that he'd read just about everything available on this subject, and nothing came close to my work. Here's what Mike Roper actually says.
Hi, I'm Mike Roper. I'm a physicist mathematician. I have a BSc in physics and an MSc in mathematics, and I've been interested very much in Eastern philosophy, particularly Hinduism and Buddhism, and their connections with physics for 50 years. So when I came across Graham's work a few years ago, I was really amazed. I'd read many works by Alan Wallace and others who are very good, but it's the sheer detail in physics and in the Buddhist philosophy that was truly impressive. I mean, it is really unique. And he's taken a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics and a particular view of the greater Madhyamaka in Tibetan Buddhism, and shown that they're very, very, very similar. In fact, they gel very well together. And by and large, I agree with his view. It is a remarkable achievement. I should also say I'm a chartered physicist. I'm a member of the Institute of Physics, and I'm an associate member of the Institute of Mathematics and its applications. So anyway, so I feel fairly qualified to have this opinion. So thank you.
So after spending a long period of time, my first book took me about 10 years of research, almost daily, going through many physics books, most of the popular physics books, but also looking at online papers. So I didn't just go to popular works. I bought, very expensive original text by Henry Stapp and various other people. Looked at original papers, as I said. Went through a multitude of Buddhist texts to get very significant insights, only to find what I can only call basically is a New-Age fraud and a plagiarizer. Just take bits and pieces from my work, plonk them into his very misleading hodgepodge of New Age fantasy, as if they were his own insights. He hasn't got a clue. And later on we'll see some of the evidence. But the evidence is irrefutable. When you do an analysis of various long strings of words, paragraphs, references, mismatches and stuff like this, it's irrefutable. So also one can say that, given that my work, as Mike Roper has just told you, he does know what he's talking about, is so precise and extensive, the fact that all these people are actually, promoting what is a work of almost quantum fiction, and that Levy, who has actually said to me in an email that he always tells people about my work, but that's a lie. I've watched many of his interviews. He has not mentioned my work once, even though his book is clearly inspired by it. Let us look at some of the claims that Levy makes in his book. The double-slit experiment gave an incarnate birth. Really? Incarnate birth? To the field of quantum physics. It was as if the physical world, i.e. matter, took the form of an experiment so as to transmit the quantum nature of reality into our minds. Okay, that's a direct quote from Paul Levy. Well, the first thing is really it's not true, because the instigating experiment for quantum theory was actually the photoelectric effect. That's what started it all off, because it destroyed ideas of the continuity of electromagnetic radiation. And because of that, when Einstein looked at the photoelectric effect, he suddenly realized that radiation was discrete in quanta. And that was the big breakthrough, which started the whole field of quantum physics, really, the photoelectric effect, for which Einstein got the Nobel Prize. He didn't get it for relativity. And the idea of an experiment giving an incarnate birth, I know there are things called metaphors, but really. Because what he's claiming here, when he says that it was as if the physical world, i.e. matter, so the material world he's talking about, took the form of an experiment so as to transmit the quantum nature of reality into our minds. So think about it. What's he saying? His metaphor is that the physical world, the material world, on its own account started pondering away to itself. I think these human beings need to be informed that we don't really exist, or the material world doesn't really exist the way they think it does. What do you think, brick wall? Well, lampshade, I think you're right. I think these human beings, they've been wandering around in delusion far too long. Yes, brick wall, I think it's exactly right. We need to inform these human beings that we don't exist the way we appear to. What should we do? Lampshade. Well, brick wall, I think what we should do is we'll concoct an experiment for them, don't you know? So that we can beam this information directly into their minds. Now, I'm obviously being very, very silly, almost infantile, because these kind of metaphors are infantile. which is why grown-up people with reasoning scientific minds find this kind of stuff ridiculous. So let's go on. The insights of quantum physics are like a metabolic antitoxin designed to dissolve the calcified complex and restore elasticity to the psyche. Really? Most people don't even comprehend quantum physics. Most people's minds are completely calcified by quantum physics because it's so weird. I mean, is there any evidence for this? Or is it just infantile fantasy? Overblown rhetoric? Designed for New Age wow factor for gullible minds? Quantum physics is the flag bearer of an epochal paradigm shift currently taking place within human consciousness, deep in the collective unconsciousness, concerning the nature of reality itself. There's absolutely no evidence for this whatsoever. Again, it's a delusion. It's a delusion which is peddled over and over and over again on New Age sites which offer courses on how you can join the new global consciousness. The evidence for global shifting consciousness is only in the minds of a very, very few people who are dining out on it and making money off of it. As if bewitched, we entrance ourselves by our own innate, unrealized genius for co-creating reality. Now, Paul Levy is very good at co-creating reality. What happens is if somebody else creates something, because according to him, he's co-creating, he can take what this other person has done by me, put it in his book, and not bother to tell you because he's co-created it. So I mean, this idea we're all co-creating reality is very useful for the plagiarizer, don't you know? We are powerful wizards, wielding a magic wand, the quantum. You can only laugh when you're confronted with something. The fact that someone like Menas Capitos, or Minas Capitos, who I thought was a respectable physicist, scientist, I can't remember what his field of study is. Just check him out. Yeah, Menas Capitos is a physicist. And he takes this utter drivel. The quantum is a magic wand. The quantum is a metabolic antitoxin. Really? This is Jean Bricmont. I mean, he spits blood when he comes across this kind of stuff. He can't believe anybody talks this kind of utter drivel. And he writes great books. I mean, unlike some, I research both sides. And I find actually going through the rigour of stuff like this to actually hone down on exactly what can be said. And this is what's so important, to stop these adolescent, infantile fantasies worthy of bedtime reading, and to look at what hardcore people assert, what the evidence actually is, to try and come up with reasonable accounts, reasonable indications of the mystical depths of the universe, because the universe does have a mystical depth, but it's not revealed by reading the latest New-Age pot boiler, New-Age plagiaristic fantasy. And the first chapter of this book, Making Sense of Quantum Mechanics, is called A Physicist in Wonderland. And I love this. According to the French newspaper Le Monde, a famous English rugby player, Johnny Wilkinson, claims to have been saved from depression by studying quantum physics. The player even held a public conference with two well-known French physicists. The conference was published under the title Quantum Rugby. Anyway, Brigmont goes on to say the idea that quantum physics should save somebody from depression he finds slightly alarming. But to be quite fair, I mean, what he doesn't say here is that what Johnny Wilkinson actually says is his reading of quantum theory led him to Buddhism. Even a rugby player discovered that there are connections between quantum theory and Buddhism. We won't go into that just now. Anyway, on to the next fantasy insight and part of Levy. Right, we've just had the quantum is a magic wand. I mean, what would Brigmont think? The revelations of quantum theory are a modern-day version of an occult-like secret. This constant overinflation. And now I'm convinced, having seen all the YouTube cacophony of people setting up their channels, and then the same people go on the channel to be interviewed, the same nonsense is peddled backwards and forwards, and these channels get these massive followings. I imagine they get massive incomes eventually. It certainly helps their egos. And you might say, well, what are you doing? You're making this. Yes. 10 years after I wrote my first book, I resiliently tried not to do this stuff precisely because I didn't want to get involved in this. I turned down a chance to go and see the Dalai Lama precisely because I didn't think I should need to go tugging at the robes of a high-ranking, very high-ranking Buddhist leader. I've been prodded into doing this by people saying I should do it, and also final exasperation. How the world of the quantum manifests depends on how we dream it. So, you see, according to Levy, we are able, apparently, to dream up the world in any way we want. Just dream it the way we want, and it will come into existence just the way we want it. Just to make sure he really does mean this, let's have a look at what he says in his book, The Quantum Revelation. He says, quantum physics indicates that our entire universe is arising exactly as a dream arises, as an immediate and unmediated reflection of the observing consciousness. As viewed, so appears, is an all-pervasive and universal law in the light of consciousness, as gravity is in the physical dimension. Contemplating as viewed, so appears can be a catalyst to awaken in us the realization how, in this very moment, we are dreaming up the universe into materialization out of the infinite field of unmanifest quantum potential. If we change the way we view our dream while having it, the dream has no choice but to spontaneously shapeshift and mirror back this change in perception, changing the way it appears. So just change your dream and the universe changes. It's quite clear. This is what Levy says. And it is utter, I've got to be careful what I say here, nonsense, shall we say. There are other words I could use, but I'm trying to be fairly civilized. Now, according to Stephen Hawking and Leonard Malotino in their book The Grand Design, they actually tell us that one of the histories in the probability mix for the history of the universe is one where the moon is made of cheese. They actually say that. This idea that the universe does not have a unique observer-independent history might seem to conflict with certain facts that we know. There might be one history in which the moon is made of Roquefort cheese. This might sound like science fiction, but it isn't. So does this mean that Levy actually thinks that if I want to dream up a moon made of cheese, that I can actually dream up a moon this very moment made of cheese? Because that's what it seems to say. Now, the evidence of the canonical, or the what should we say, the central experiment, the double slit experiment within quantum theory, quantum physics, suggests that in some sense consciousness or mind is involved in the way that reality appears, but the actual evidence doesn't tell us that we can go around beaming rays of intentionality, deciding which potentiality, even if we knew what potentialities exactly were in the environmental quantum wave function, Oh dear, I've run out of petrol. Oh, there's a potentiality in the quantum wave function for the universe to have petrol in my car. Perhaps I better dream it up now. Petrol! It's nonsense. The double-slit experiment merely suggests that when you organise an experiment so that you don't know which particular slit a quantum entity goes through, then you get a wave phenomena, the interference effect. But if you organise the experiment so that you do know which slit it goes through, you get a particle. So the only concrete evidence we have is that in very delicate quantum experiments, we can make a very small, tiny portion of the universe manifest as wave or particle. So the conscious choices made within this experiment does affect the way the experiment manifests. And the so-called delayed choice, where the experimental setup is decided after the quantum entity has gone past the slits, hence delayed choice, we choose after the point where the particle has to choose, or the quantum entity has to choose, indicates this might happen backwards in time. Hence Wheeler's idea that we create the universe backwards in time, which is endorsed also by Stephen Hawking and Leonard Plotino. But there's no evidence in any quantum experiment that I can dream up a Mars bar in front of me this very moment in time, or choose any particular... I mean, even having to point this out, you begin to wonder, again, people who seem to think they're serious researchers, philosophers or New Age thinkers, take this seriously. Let's have a look what Jean Bricmont has to say. And Bricmont is fair. Quantum sense and nonsense. Even those who, like Wheeler and Wigner, consider that quantum mechanics gives a certain role to consciousness in physics, do not think that our conscious choices affect nature in any way. In other words, what he's saying is that even if we accept that quantum experiment shows that consciousness, mind, is involved in some way, Wheeler and also Wigner, who also thought that human consciousness was involved, do not say we can decide which potentialities become manifest. Now, unfortunately, Wheeler did have a penchant for saying mystical things going beyond what was academically thought respectable at the time, and he did wax lyrical on various issues, and later on tended to retract. He would say, "Oh universe, I depend on you and you depend on me." Let's have a look at the actual quote. Okay, here's the quote from Wheeler, John Wheeler, the great John Wheeler. Yes, O universe, without you, I would not have been able to come into being. Yet you, great system, are made of phenomena, and every phenomena rests on an act of observation. You could never even exist without elementary acts of registration such as mine. In this book, Guyon's Black Holes and Quantum Foam, A Life in Physics, which is the biography of John Wheeler, rather the autobiography written with Kenneth Ford, you will find quite a famous picture in Quantum Physics Circle. This was drawn by John Wheeler to illustrate his idea that in some way life and mind, as he put it, created reality backwards in time from quantum potentialities which existed at the dawn of time. And he writes in this book, reasoning like this, and this is reasoning based on the quantum delayed choice experiment, where whether a quantum entity becomes wave or particle can be decided after the point where it becomes wave or particle. So it seems that a conscious choice actually creates or affects reality backwards in time. But this experiment functions at quantum level. So Wheeler says, reasoning like this has made me ask whether the universe is a self-excited circuit, a system whose existence and whose history are determined by measurements. By measurement, I do not mean an observation carried out by a human or human-designed instrument. And then a bit further down the page, we read, about the diagram. My diagram of a big U attempts to illustrate this idea. The upper right end of the U represents the Big Bang, when it all started, and then the universe evolves around the U until we get to the I. Finally, the I of the observer. By looking back, by observing what happened in the earliest days of the universe, we give reality to those days. So you can see where Levy gets his inspiration. But the point is, Wheeler says he didn't actually mean it. The eye could well have been a piece of mica. So anything can observe backwards in time. So Wheeler thinks observation isn't really sort of consciousness involved, or consciousness is not involved in observations. Anything, pieces of mica, rock, chairs, whatever, walls, I don't know, atoms, not consciousness. one finds this kind of deviousness, this ambiguity in quite a lot of quantum metaphysics on the part of physicists. But the issue is, does the fact that Wheeler was like to say mystical things at one point and then tell you he didn't really mean it, validate this overinflation of the quantum evidence? Is it the case that John Wheeler is deciding which acts of registration, and notice it uses the term registration in order to, he seesaws between talking about, creating with observations or creating through registration. One of them suggests consciousness, the other doesn't. And this is why, he's ambiguous. But the situation does not seem to suggest that we can pick what bits of the quantum wave function we can activate at any point in time. Bernard D'Espinay is another quantum physicist who thinks that consciousness is involved in some way. Now, he says, we sometimes build up quite beautifully rational theories that experiments falsify. Something says no. This something cannot be just us. There must be something else than just us. If Levy was to be correct about dreaming up the universe whichever way we wanted, we can make any experiment give us any result we wanted. As D'Espinay says, there's something objective within the experiments, even though there is an obvious dependence upon consciousness. It's not a dependency which involves us deciding what we want the results to be. So ideas of dreaming up the universe on a whim is just delusional, misleading rubbish. However, within limits, of course, that the mind has an effect. And sometimes it appears as if the mind has an effect beyond what we would expect it to be. This leads to so-called, parapsychological effects, parapsychology and so forth. And such effects do seem to be real. But they do not seem to be something that people can call up on a whim all the time according to their personal desires. The situation seems to be far more complex than that. If we look at what the Russian physicist Michael Mensky says about this, it's very interesting. The following quote is from an article written by Michael Mensky titled Logic of Quantum Mechanics and the Phenomenon of Consciousness. Mensky tells us that probabilistic miracles essentially differ from absolute miracles that happen in fairy tales. The difference is that the event realized as a probabilistic miracle through the force of consciousness may in principle happen in a quite natural way, although with quite a small probability. This small but non-zero probability is very important. And he talks about what he calls a post-corrective mechanism through which consciousness may magnify quantum potentialities to make ones which do not have the highest probability actually manifest. But note, he makes a distinction between absolute miracles, in which he says happens in fairy tales, not in real life, and probabilistic miracles. And what he's saying is, in certain circumstances, consciousness can have an effect. But this isn't, a fairy tale effect. It is quite a natural quantum effect. But the number of times it happens and the certainty of such things happening is not guaranteed. It's let's take the example of collective prayer for somebody to get well. Sometimes this is known to have worked. And Mensky would say this is a probabilistic miracle. But would you say that this particular prayer group can cure anybody on a whim? Just go to every hospital, we'll go into a room, say some prayers, they'll get better. No, of course not. There are many, many other factors. Now, what Levy is offering you is the juvenile notion of a fairy tale universe which involves fairy tale quantum events that he claims occurs when you want to beam your desire to have cheese moons or whatever. It's rubbish. But this does not mean that within limits and within the play of other conditions, which within Buddhism would be called karma, sometimes consciousness has remarkable effects which may produce what appear to be miracles. But we do not create the world around us by beaming rays of intentionality. We do not go around dreaming up the material world, moment by moment. So let's continue our exploration of some of the ludicrous claims made by Levy in his book. I've got a list here in my book, Quantum Revelations of the Real and Unreal. Quantum mechanics was like a Kabbalistic secret that God revealed to Bohr. Bohr, of course, is Niels Bohr. Is one of the central figures, of course, of the Copenhagen interpretation. So, this is a quote that Levy just plonks in, and he gives a reference, but he doesn't seem to have bothered to see what the quote actually meant, because he presents it as being a serious quote, that somebody actually thinks that quantum mechanics is like a Kabbalistic secret that God revealed to Bohr. And this is the example of Levy misrepresenting a quote so that it appears to mean something it doesn't actually mean, which to my mind is intellectual fraud. So, where does this quote come from, and what is it all about? The quote is from a paper by Scott Aronson. And the paper is called Are Quantum States Exponentially Long Vectors? And this paper's got nothing to do with quantum mysticism, quantum consciousness. It's actually a paper in complexity theory. Are quantum states exponentially long vectors? And in the conclusion, Aronson makes a joke. And here's the joke. For almost a century, quantum mechanics was like the Kabbalistic secret that God revealed to Bohr. Bohr revealed to the physicists, and the physicists revealed, clearly, to no one. It's a joke. Now, to me, this is fraudulent behaviour. And the people who have endorsed. Let's look at some of the endorsements now. Gene Houston. This is one of the most important books that I have ever read. Caroline Myss, or Mace, I'm not sure how she pronounces it. The Quantum Revelation is a masterpiece. This book is utterly brilliant. Richard Rudd, author of The Gene Keys. This is a deeply alchemical work of breathtaking scope. Well, of course it is. He had 10 years of my research to use. Dean Radin, PhD, Chief Scientist, Institute of Noetic Sciences. This book can change your life. Menace C. Capitus. He endorses it. He doesn't go over the top. But there's some of the endorsements. And if you start actually digging, you don't have to spend much time checking out his references to see whether they really do mean what he claims they mean, and not all of them do. Levy begins his deceptive campaign early in his book, on the first page of the introduction, to be precise. The start of the second paragraph, we read that the highly respected mathematical physicist John von Neumann said, as early as 1932, that consciousness exists in and has entered the equations of quantum mechanics. But von Neumann did not say that. In fact, I was looking on a physics forum, and I came across one of the members writing the following. It's often claimed that in Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics, von Neumann concluded that it's the observer's consciousness that collapses the wave function. But I am reading chapter 6 of the book, word by word, and I don't find this conclusion. The closest is where he mentions the observer's abstract ego. So the truth of it is that von Neumann was non-committal, and in fact he used the term abstract ego to avoid committing himself to saying that is definitely the observer's consciousness. It was Eugene Wigner, quite a lot later, who decided that the abstract ego was consciousness. But it wasn't von Neumann who said that. On page 3 of his introduction, Levy writes, and here he is referring to the important anti-quantum consciousness physicists. Let me repeat, he is now referring to the anti-quantum consciousness. John Bell. Now, John Bell was big time anti the notion that consciousness was involved. He hated the idea and thought it was nonsense. Regarding the implications of quantum physics, John Bell, one of the most important physicists of the latter half of the 20th century, is of the opinion that the new way of seeing things will involve an imaginative leap that will astonish us. Yeah. But the imaginative leap that John Bell envisaged was one which would kick consciousness out of the equation for eternity. He considered the idea that consciousness was involved was completely absurd. John Bell, in response to the proposal made by John Wheeler that quantum potentialities in the past, which refers to as the wave function of the world, were collapsed into actuality by observations backwards in time. Well, John Bell spoke of this and he said, scathingly, was the wave function of the world waiting to jump for thousands of years until a single-celled living creature appeared? Or did it have to wait a little longer for some better qualified system with a PhD? I mean, this shows you just how absurd John Bell thought the idea that it required, what John Bell just thought, well, it means that, when animals get on the scene, or do we need human beings, or do we need particular types of human beings, highly educated ones, and only those could collapse wave functions? I mean, I'm not sure that Levy has supplied an answer to John Bell's question. But certainly John Bell thought notions about consciousness collapsing wave functions backwards in time were absurd. So he was thinking that quantum physics at the time was completely mixed up. And he was looking for an imaginative leap which would give him back a real semi-material world. John Bell would have no truck with quantum consciousness, but you would not know this to read Levy. Again, he is misrepresenting what the quote really means. On the next to last page of his introduction, he tells us, in 1908, Einstein wrote in a letter, "This quantum problem is so uncommonly important and difficult, it should be everyone's concern." Now, Levy gives the impression that Einstein went around the world telling everyone he met, the butcher, baker, candlestick maker, road sweeper, local publican, everyone. He went down the street screaming to everyone, "Look, stop what you're doing. We've got to solve the quantum problem. But of course, this is deranged, lunatic nonsense. Einstein was writing to the physicists that he was, at the time, working with, some of whom were researching other issues. So he was just saying, look, drop the other issues. We need to focus on this particular problem. But the idea that Einstein thought, the entire population of the world needed to focus its attention on quantum problems, I mean, come on, think about it. Anybody with a functioning brain should realize this is deceptive, schoolboy nonsense. I mean, here, this claim that, quantum mechanics is a Kabbalistic secret, it's a joke. Quantum mechanics is like a precious treasure thirsting to be brought forth. I mean, people have taken this drivel seriously. Quantum mechanics is like a precious treasure. And it gets worse. The emergence of the quantum is like the discovery of the mythic Holy Grail. Like the evil godfather in Sleeping Beauty, the Matrix keeps a liberating quantum gnosis asleep. But it is up to us to cast a counterspell to help wake up Sleeping Beauty of quantum physics. Oh, so quantum physics is like Sleeping Beauty now. If you don't think this is utterly infantile nonsense, I despair. Quantum physics, according to Levy, is analogous to Sleeping Beauty. And people take this nonsense, this infantile drivel, seriously. And Levy's plagiarised my work and cast it amidst this nonsense. Dear me. Now, Levy does actually give a citation, a reference to my work in one place in his book, page 150, to quote Graham Smetham, author of Quantum Buddhism, Dancing in Emptiness. Quote, "The appearance of the material world is a matter of deeply etched quantum epiontic memes." End the quote. Now, as I shall show in just a moment, the way he actually puts that quote in indicates that that is all I have to say on the matter, or that the rest of what he's about to write is his own work, when in fact, after he's given that very short little quote, one line, 1.5 lines, he then continues to précis a load of stuff from my books, taken from the discussion of Wojciech Zurek, Yogacara philosophy, and how perception creates reality through the ground consciousness. And he continues to write in this vein. He's also written previously in this section, Levy that is, without telling people, without referencing the fact that he's just rearranging stuff he's taken from my work. In other words, several pages here not that it matters very much, but page 150 and slightly before and slightly after is basically just plagiarism from my work with rearranged words and so forth. And in the middle of it he gives a short little reference to what is in fact a joke. And this is extraordinary because, I mean, the reference he's given is insignificant. What he doesn't tell you is that the idea that the world is comprised of epiontic means is not something I take seriously. It's not something I actually propose as a worthwhile view, proposal, or theory even. It's a joke against Richard Dawkins. Let's see what I actually say. Okay, the actual sentence, or let's look at a paragraph. The quantum Darwinism, or quantum mind-only perspective, requires that we view the situation from the correct quantum perspective, within which quantum dream stuff is the meaning matter of consciousness, within which meaningful billboards as to how to experience the apparent matter of the material world can be meaningfully erected. According to Zurich, quantum states, by their very nature, share an epistemological and ontological role, and they are simultaneously a description of the state and the dream stuff is made of. One might say they are epiontic. These two aspects may seem contradictory, but at least in the quantum setting there is a union of these two functions. That's the end of the Zurich quote, Wojciech Zurich. Back to me. In other words, the quantum dream stuff of reality is capable of producing the seeming solidity of the material world from out of the process of perception. Although Dawkins would hate the idea, the quantum evidence points towards the fact that the appearance of the material world is a matter of deeply etched quantum epiontic memes. Furthermore, these quantum memes are not material but essentially comprised of experiential probabilities encoded into the wave functions of consciousness. Now, what is important here is to realize that this is actually situated in a long discussion of Wojciech Zurich's idea of quantum Darwinism and Buddhist Yogacara, or mind-only, psychometaphysics. Now, Yogacara, in the time of Yogacara, it's about 4th century AD, it was consciousness only. Later on, this became, in a Tibetan context, it became mind only, but that distinction is not relevant, particularly in this context. The point is here we're looking at the idea that the essential nature of reality is consciousness, although not floaty. It is a deep deeper level of primordial consciousness, kind of mind energy. And that's what we see when we examine the quantum world. But as I say, this is located in the long discussion in which I'm developing my theory, my own analysis of Wojciech Zurek and mind-only Buddhism or consciousness-only Buddhism. I am amending, as far as I can see. I am modifying Wojciech Zurek notion of what epiontic is all about and what quantum Darwinism is all about. Hence, in my book, you won't be able to see it, I'm sure, but I just it's here. The beginning of this section says the quantum Darwinism or quantum mind only. Now, the idea of a quantum mind only is something I made up. I've taken the ideas of Wojciech Zurek, modified them. This is important. I've modified them by saying, well, Zurek has really got this wrong, because Zurek is a non-consciousness only. Zurek does not mean, Zurek does not intend, does not state at all what Levy says he states. Because Levy thinks that Zurek is a fully paid up angelic member of the conscious floaty dream only brigade, when he is not. The reason that Levy makes this mistake and clearly doesn't understand Zurek is that he never checks to see what the original papers actually contain. He never checks to bother, he never bothers to look and study original papers. I'll show you, in fact, he gives references where they don't relate to the quote whatsoever, because the paper he references, or the book he references, is several years before the quote he's suggested it relates to. This is not research. It's quote mining without even bothering to note whether the quote comes from the right place. But I mean, another reason why he gets it wrong is because in quantum Buddhism, and I'll have to admit to this, I was a bit imprecise with my presentation. Conclusions I draw by taking Zurek's ideas through those of Stapp and then those of quantum consciousness-only Buddhism, if you don't read them carefully, you might think this is what Zurek is saying, when it's not. I mean, for instance, I say in quantum Buddhism, this is the metaphor which Zurek is extending to the generation of the classical macroscopic material world. The more often a perception of the appearance of materiality is made, the more potent becomes the advertising billboard campaign. Well, that is slightly misleading, because this is Zurek when amplified with consciousness-only Buddhism, but I don't actually make that clear. Each subjective experience injects one bit of information into this objective store of information, and that's Henry Stapp. You see, so what I'm doing is running through the views of Zurek, Stapp, and mind-only Buddhism. And if you're not paying attention, if you're just cutting and pasting my work and then changing words here and there, you could easily misunderstand. Easily think that maybe Zurek's saying it, but Zurek's saying the opposite. It's only when you put Zurek with Henry Stapp and mind-only Buddhism, you come to the epiontic perception is creating reality, Zurek. has the opposite point of view. But I mean, Levy doesn't know this because he doesn't check original papers, as we shall now see. So I shall now read from Quantum Revelations of the Real and Unreal, a section dealing with how did Levy come to know about Zurich's ideas about epiontic? As I say, there's no direct reference to any papers, and in the bibliography the only book was written prior to speculation and research and papers written about the epiontic process. Now, here is something very curious. Levy's exposition in the section under the heading Dream Stuff is fairly detailed, seemingly coherent, and appears to elucidate the implications of Zurich's notion of epiontic quantum dream stuff. If that is, the reader knows nothing about what Zurich actually says in his research papers. One would expect that Levy has read original articles, papers penned by Zurich and his associates concerning these terms. And yet, the only Zurich references Levy gives do not mention these core quantum epiontic dream stuff aspects that Levy seems to know so much about. Very curious. The main reference that Levy gives in the bibliography for the work of Zurich is the Book of Collected Papers Between Quantum and Cosmos, Studies and Essays in Honour of John Archibald Wheeler. But an internet search inside this book, using Google Books, indicates that neither the term dream stuff nor the term epiontic is contained in any of these essays. Very strange. But that collection of essays was published in 1988, which is well before terms like epiontic and quantum dream stuff started to be used by Zurich. The dawn of such terminology was around 2003, when Zurich published his paper Quantum Darwinism and Invariance. Curiouser and curiouser, don't you think? And the only reason Levy makes this mistake is that he's plagiarising my work. He's cutting and pasting, rearranging, sticking stuff in between, looking for other quotes he can stick in between to try and cover the fact that there's loads of plagiarism here. But, you know, in this book, I meticulously go through showing you the cutting and pasting, the resonances of words, the small changes of words. Not in every section of Levy's book, but in enough. It is egregious. Egregious. Love that word. Anyway, that he's actually plagiarising my work, getting it wrong, and is attributing to Zurich, wrongly, a quantum mind-only point of view, which I developed. But, you know, and not only that, you will see Wonders of the Universe, Quantum Buddhist, or Quantum Buddhism Wonders of the Universe as well. Both of these books, Levy clearly told me when he asked me what other books he should read before writing his book, he had these. and he wanted to know what other of my works he could plunder. But I mean, again, there are, I analysed the actual quantum equations here, actually indicating which bits of the equation I assign the observer to, and so forth. The equations in diagrammatic form. So here you can see an observer plonked in the middle of the equations. But this is page after page of analysis of what the equations mean and what various quantum physicists have said about the equations and how the various physicists can be realigned with each other with philosophical coherence. You'll find none of this in Levy. You'll just find stuff taken out and plonked in his book and wrongly understood. And much of it is taken from my books. Certainly in this section, and there's other sections as well. I've found, not only that, because he's taken bits from my work, he plagiarises other people because he takes them out of my work. And he likes it. If he likes, say, a turn of phrase that somebody's used, he'll stick it down and either forget or not bother to point out that they come from another work. For instance, he'll say, let's have an example. The revelations of quantum physics put us into very unusual situations. Everything we call real is composed of things that themselves cannot be regarded as real. That observation about the real and unreal, real entities apparently being derived from unreal entities, is attributed to Niels Bohr. Everything we call real is made of things that cannot be regarded as real. And Roger Penrose added to that observation, as I point out in my book and on the back of my book, in fact. So Roger Penrose said, undoubtedly the world is strange and unfamiliar at the quantum level, but it is not unreal. How, indeed, can real objects be constructed from unreal constituents? That's Roger Penrose. And Nagarjuna, the great Buddhist philosopher, 2nd century AD, actually gave the solution. Everything is real and not real. Both real and not real. Neither real nor not real. That is the Lord Buddha's teaching. And that's where the title of this book, Quantum Revelations of the Real and Unreal, comes from. Here we go. Every quantum system has an inside and an outside that are inseparably connected. That's taken from Nick Herbert, physicist. So, I mean, there are others, which I just try to spot them as they go along. Oh, look, Henry Stapp wrote a paper on how quantum physics was concordant with the idea of the notion of a kind of mystical God, and he just quotes this, but he just says, well, quantum physics is concordant with the idea of a God. He doesn't cite Henry Stapp. Again, even though it's a small section, it's still plagiarism. He's almost certainly, I mean, he's not read these papers. I know he's not, because I've looked at the papers he says stuff comes from when it comes to Zurich, and it's just not there. You know, sometimes there's no connection between what he says things mean and what they actually do mean. As I say, sometimes he gets it right, but it's actually, you know, whether actually he actually gets his attributions right, and whether he actually bothers to give a citation, well, you know, it is a matter of quantum probabilities. I think this is what it is. He may be a Zen master in disguise, and what he's doing, he's showing us the quantum probabilistic nature of the universe, because whether he cites the appropriate source for what he's saying depends on quantum probabilities, don't you know? Anyway, returning to the issue of his plagiarizing of my discussion of Zurich and my development of the quantum mind-only perspective based on Zurich, but transformed through my putting Zurich right, let's say, by melding him with the insights of Henry Stapp's mind-only universe, mindful universe, and mind-only Buddhism. What Zurich says, basically, is that quantum star contains the ontology, but is also the medium by which information is extracted by human beings and presumably other animals. Okay, so therefore quantum stuff is both the ontology and the mean through which we know. It's not, in Zurich's world, it's not the case that perception creates reality. In other words, Paul Levy has got this completely wrong. If this book had been reviewed to somebody who knew what he was talking about, they'd have realised that Levy does not know what he's talking about. Okay, this is from a very important paper by Wojciech Zurek, Decoherence and the Transition from Quantum to Classical, Revisited. While the ultimate evidence for the choice of one alternative resides in our elusive consciousness, there is every indication that the choice occurs much before consciousness ever gets involved. So Zurich is saying the exact opposite to what Levy thinks Zurich says. And yet, according to Levy, he's read these papers. So either he's not learnt to read properly, or he hasn't really read the papers. And from my analysis, he hasn't read the papers. He's just cut and pasted a quote and assumed the quote means what he wants it to mean. And here is another quote from Zurich. It doesn't take a conscious observer carrying out a measurement to snap an object from a quantum to a classical state. Just a nudge from its surroundings. So Zurich is saying the exact opposite. To what Levy claims he's saying. And yet there's a physicist called Menas Kapitos who also thinks that Levy's infantile fantasy production is valid quantum physics, even though he's saying certain quantum physicists who clearly state that consciousness is not involved, Levy just says, oh, well, I know better, I'm not a quantum physicist, no. Here's the quote I want, I'll put it here, and this is what it will mean. I don't care, I won't bother to actually look whether it really does mean this, I'll just leave it because it looks good. You know, groovy, man, we're all dreaming. Yes, you are dreaming, Paul Levy. As far as I know, and I've just done a quick internet search to check this, the only person who has argued for and demonstrated why the term epiontic should mean perception creates reality, and I've done so by basically asserting that Zurich is wrong in his view that, Zurich actually says that decoherence, i.e. the way that already stabilized quantum stuff interacts with non-stabilized quantum stuff to produce a kind of ontology, a fixed reality from it, functions, applies to our minds as well. So I'll just, in case you don't believe me, I'll just... Any quantum superposition of the states of the neurons in the brain will be destroyed far too quickly for us to be conscious of the quantum goings on. Decoherence, more to the point, which is environmentally induced superselection, applies to our own state of mind. Let me say this again. This is Zurich. Environment-induced superselection applies to our own state of mind. This is prime technical claim that Zurich says perception creates ontology based on his misunderstanding of the term epiontic, because he's plagiarizing me, and I use the term epiontic that way, but I have given a great deal of analysis over many pages of why I think it's correct to use the term epiontic in a way which is actually almost contradicts Zurich's terminology. I mean, I'd actually think his term epiontic is almost Zurich. I think it's underhanded, because basically he's claiming, the fact that quantum stuff conveys information does not make it epistemological, it just means it's got information in it. Epistemological really should, in my view, involve the actual perceiving process. But I mean, this is a matter of terminology, I guess. But certainly Levy's has not got a clue what Zurich is on about. Now, following his small little quote of my Dawkins joke, which I guess he thinks, well, as soon as I've actually put one quote in from the original source, I can now carry on the plagiarism, as if I've not, I can take other stuff from him on the basis of giving him a little nod with this quote. But I mean, what follows afterwards is more or less plagiarism from me. And he goes to talk about my idea, and again, it's my idea, which is developed through a very rigorous and in-depth analysis. Remember, Mike Roper, chartered physicist, says he's not come across anybody who's done such rigorous research in this field, in which I go into the way that one can understand perception creating reality through a process of karmic resonance. When one understands Zurich's got it wrong, but Zurich's ideas can be put through the lens of Yogacara Buddhism, where perceptions in the past create perceptions in future. That's Yogacara Buddhism. And then I apply it to Zurich to come up with the idea of karmic resonance, and I also point out that this accords with Sheldrake's ideas of morphogenetic fields, and I go into a long discussion and investigation, exploration of these ideas, all in my development of an idea of karmic resonance. And what do you know? Levy just plucks my idea of karmic resonance, and he just thinks, I'll just call it karmic rut. If I call what he calls karmic resonance karmic rut, I needn't actually tell people that all this stuff is taken from his books and just words rearranged and so forth. Oh, what a good idea. I love this quantum dreamy universe, you know. Does Levy. Note the similarity to biology. See, he's writing it as if this is all whispered into his ear from some cosmic genie that he's evoked through the dreamy quantum potentiality that he's created with his magical mind. Dreamed up this genie to give him the quantum essence. It's taken from my books. Note the similarity to biologist Rupert Sheldrake's idea of morphogenetic fields. Sheldrake is of the opinion that memory is inherent in nature, and that the laws of nature are more like ingrained habit patterns. Well, of course, he's taking Sheldrake here, not me, but here comes me, to create a well-worn groove or karmic rut in our perceptual system that makes it more probable that, and this is all taken from, all these ideas are taken from my work. And in my work, of course, I quote, I tell you which ones come from Sheldrake, which ones come from Zurich, from Stapp, and what my ideas are, the way I meld all this stuff together. Use of Wheeler. I mean, even his use of Wheeler is fraudulent to the extent that he doesn't actually tell you that Wheeler himself was an opponent of quantum mystical ideas. And in fact, a vehement opponent of quantum mystical ideas. Now, you may say, well, you know, I use Wheeler. Yes, I do, but in my books I tell you Wheeler was an opponent. I tell you this is what Wheeler says, and if you look at it from the point of view this, that, you know, Buddhism and so forth, and analyse it logically, this must follow, and that these ideas have credibility. But Wheeler himself, most of the time, didn't seem to think so. Here we have the book about The Quantum Labyrinth by Paul Levy, which is basically about the work of John Wheeler and Richard Feynman and their interaction and relationship. And we read, Wheeler's speculative notions, always a bit on the fringes, had become almost unfathomably abstract. They were so philosophical that no one could imagine how to test them. What kind of experimental data could resolve questions such as, how come existence? Yet Wheeler had no desire to be known as a New Age guru or pseudoscientist. He complained vehemently, for example, when at a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, he found himself seated on a panel with parapsychologists. Neither did Feynman want such associations. Goes on to talk about experiments with flotation tanks. A portrayal in the September 1986 issue of Reader's Digest, In the Mind of John Wheeler, exaggerated some of his views and brought him much unwanted attention from mystical believers. The piece implied that he had found a link between science and religion. a radical synthesis of science and religion. So the mystical believers thought that the Reader's Digest piece meant that Wheeler showed a link between science and religion. Consequently, letters began to pour in from dozens of would-be devotees from all over the world, as if he were the Maharishi of physics. He let the fan mail, undoubtedly full of crackpot theories vying for his notice, pile up and decided to ignore the incident. I think at the time, and I go into great detail in this book, about what I call the anti-quantum mystical thought police operative at the time, and there are physicists, and Wheeler actually indicates the existence of such police in very veiled terms. Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner quite clearly talk about the fact that you would get kicked out of your research program. So I mean, but the point is, Wheeler did not clearly and with conviction come out as a fully paid up angelic quantum mystic. And if you want to put him forward as one, you've got to actually show exactly why it is correct to do so, given that he actually repudiated people who wanted to put him in the mystical category. So what does Paul Levy say about this? Oh look, just discovered another piece of plagiarism, this time from Henry Stapp. So, in Paul Levy's book, page 281, quantum theory, seen through a theological lens, is concordant with the idea of a powerful God that creates the universe to get things started, but then bequeaths part of his power to beings created in his or her image. These beings then have power through their choices to co-create with the very universe that created them. Now, this is Henry Stapp in an article called Minds and Values in the Quantum Universe. The situation is concordant with the idea of a powerful God that creates the universe and its laws to get things started, but then bequeaths part of his power to beings created in his own image, at least with regard to their power to make physically efficacious decisions. That is plagiarism. Now, I doubt Levy actually took it from this book. He took it from my book, because I quote Henry Stapp and I say, but quite a few quotes he's taken from my work. He's never even seen this book. Anyway, yes, I mean, there are more. There are more. I noticed when reading, I just think, oh look that, oh look that. I wrote to the publisher, didn't hear a word back. So how does Paul Levy deal with the fact that Wheeler seemingly disavowed people who thought he was a quantum mystic and had no time for them. And this does indeed seem to be the case. I mean, he was not happy. And he did seem most of the time to say consciousness had nothing to do with it. Well, Levy tells us the following. Wheeler can also be seen to exemplifying the complementary principle in another way. You see, according to Levy knows, Wheeler was a Zen master. One of the major themes found throughout his work is how consciousness at the quantum level is involved in bringing the physical world into being. Again and again he talks about how consciousness, through innumerable acts of observer participancy, is a central factor in the materialization of the world. Yet he also writes, consciousness has nothing whatsoever to do with the quantum process. He is simultaneously asserting that consciousness both does and doesn't have to do with the quantum process, which is completely contradictory. Yes, it is. Yeah. Paradoxical and nonsensical statement. And it precisely fits with the four-valued logic of the quantum world. Now, when he's talking about the four-valued logic of the quantum world, he's talking about entities being neither existent nor non-existent, nor both existent and non-existent, nor neither existent nor non-existent. Okay? Now, there's no evidence for this whatsoever. In fact, the idea that Wheeler knew anything about four-valued logic of Buddhism, or even the quantum realm. Actually, the only person I've seen write about the four-valued logic is Giancarlo Girardi in his book Sneaking a Look at God's Cards. But, Levy does... Levy quotes Oppenheimer. Whether the position of electron remains the same, we must say no. If we ask whether electron position changes with time, we must say no, so forth. So, quantum physicists did say that things could exist and not exist, but that was at the quantum level, not at the classical manifested level. And again, this is a feature again of Levy's basic intellectual fraud, an example of him not understanding much about anything actually in terms of quantum theory or philosophy, to be quite honest, because Buddhist philosophy makes a distinction between the conventional level and the ultimate level. Now, in terms of quantum theory, the ultimate level would be quantum, and the conventional level would be the manifested classical world. The idea that Wheeler was using some kind of mystical quantum dreamlike sleight of mind is just nonsense. Wheeler himself said the reason, or indicated the reason, was because the people around him looked at him funny when he started making his mystical remarks. Again, we go back to the remarks in the book about Feynman and Wheeler, in which he repudiated any kind of Zen quantum Zen master attribution. This is pure fantasy. Levy's making stuff up as he goes along, as he does quite often in his interviews. all from a dreamy, quantum, misperceived realm of nonsense. See, the other thing Levy says is that Buddhists use full-value logic. No, they do not. The main Buddhist philosopher you can appeal to in terms of full-valued logic would be Nagarjuna, but Nagarjuna does not use full-valued logic. He uses the ordinary, everyday two-valued logic. If we used full-valued logic to build bridges, we wouldn't get very far. Neither do we get very far using full-valued logic to try and do anything. Nagarjuna uses two-valued logic, and as a result of his analysis shows that the ultimate realm has the nature of neither existent nor non-existent nor both nor neither. So what Nagarjuna does is he destroys logic with two-valued logic. Buddhists did not use full-valued logic. The ultimate realm is the realm of neither existence nor non-existence nor both nor neither. This point is made by Jan Westerhoff in his book Crushing the Categories, which is a translation, introduction and commentary to one of Nagarjuna's works. He points out that the full-valued logic applies at the ultimate level, but to say that full-valued logic applies to the conventional level will just rob you of any kind of means of logical analysis in the everyday world. It seems unsatisfactory to assume that these contradictions rule out any employment of the categories at the conventional level, for in this case any talk of epistemic instruments, of objects, inferences, examples and so forth would have to be given up, thereby effectively robbing oneself of the ability to put forward any structured philosophical arguments. This is so obvious to anybody who knows, Nagarjuna and knows, the distinction between ultimate and conventional reality. However, as we've seen, Paul Levy seems to have difficulty distinguishing between fantasy and reality.